Hello and welcome to the first lecture of human rights. Now, this is an introductory lecture. You can also call it a primer because in this lecture we will be discussing the very basics of human rights. And these lectures, before I start with, allow me to start with a disclaimer. uh, these lectures are not self-sufficient by nature because we will be requiring a lot of study material, a lot of materials from the internet, also the prescribed book of this course for having a proper grasp of it. But I'm keeping these lectures on this notion that we need to understand a few concepts because there is a lot of data, a lot of factual data which is available on internet, also in the books and so on. So what I have planned is that I will keep the lectures with more thought-provoking and more conceptual analysis and so on. So those things we will be dealing in these lectures. So this is the first lecture. There will be around 25 to 30 lectures in this series, and we will be trying to cover a lot of aspects of human rights, but not all. Let us start with what is human rights. We all know that there is a concept called human rights, and if you go to normal people and ask what are human rights, so they may not have a very clear understanding of what is human rights or what are human rights, because it is not something which is very normally available to human beings, right? Because these are certain things. Even if we talk about human rights, we talk always because we are human and we need some kind of rights, so we think that those are human rights and so on. So across culture, across countries, if you go and ask people, if you ask normal educated people, you will not have a very clear idea unless they have studied human rights, or they were students of some kind of political studies or some kind of philosophical studies and so on, that they will have a clear idea. So whenever you ask this question, what are human rights, so people will have some confusion that what are human rights. Now, let me tell you, from the very beginning, there has been this notion that human beings as individuals, as well as in a later understanding as a group member, require some special rights which are distinct from the kind of rights which are available to them because of their country, because of this, because of that, and also because of culture. And across time, you will find that this has been debated, and the history goes quite, I will say, long. So what are these things, or what are those things which we will call as human rights? Now, human rights basically are certain things which should be understood as political rights, because people can say that they are moral norms, people can say that they are ethical norms, people can say that they are social norms, people have a lot of understanding of human rights, but basically these are political rights. And why I'm calling these political rights, let us try to understand it with a very basic notion. Let us try to understand the notion of state and subject, because these are very basics which we need to understand before we delve into the concept of rights, duties, and so on. Rights are basically some kind of entitlements which we have, right? So what are those entitlements, and who is the person, or who is the body, or which body is going to provide us with those rights? So that is the understanding. Now, state is an organ which is having sovereignty. We know that state has sovereign powers in a territory. So if there is a territory, so in that territory the sovereignty lies with the state. So India will become a state, Germany will become a state, any nation will become a state, because we call usually as nations, but they are basically states. So from a political understanding, they are state, and the territory on which their sovereignty is there, the people who stay inside that state will become their subjects, because in this territory the sovereignty lies with the state, right? So they will have subjects. Now, what these subjects will do, these subjects require certain rights, and these rights are provided by the state. So rights are basically provided by the states, and because of this there are some expectation of duties. So this is also something which we understand, right? So human rights are basically political rights which are provided by the state, though it is not something which is coming out of, or is something, the principle of that human rights. Actually, if you see the history, after the Second World War, the United Nations, the formation of United Nations, and then there is something called UDHR which came. Now, what does UDHR mean? UDHR means Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, UDHR is basically a document, and most of the nations of this world, including our own nation, are signatories of UDHR, and therefore we have to abide by, or we have to make provisions so that we can include the notions of human rights, the notion of Universal Declaration of Human Rights in our own country. That is the idea. So, if you talk about India, in India, if you see the understanding or the political rights and duties, if you see, so we have Constitution of India, right? So the Constitution of India guarantees human beings a lot of rights and also expect a lot of duties. In that, if you see the fundamental rights section, that is the part 3 of the Constitution, it carries a lot of rights which are explained in UDHR as well. Okay, so in that way, we are also having a lot of human rights. Now, so this understanding, the first thing it has to be understanding, it has to be understood that it is political by nature. Because if you understand it from some other point of view, then it will be not the appropriate understanding. Culture, social, society, or say social norms, cultural norms, ethical norms, and so on. All these things are not supreme. The basic understanding has to be that it is political by nature, because these rights are provided by the state. These rights are also international. International, that means that it is not only for your own country, but it should be provided to all of us in every country. So that thing also needs to be understood, that these are basically international norms, but they are political by nature. So this thing has to be very clear in our minds. So human rights are basically these things like political rights which are provided to human beings, and they are very international by nature. They are coming out from the UDHRD document. All these things we will be discussing in the class. We will be also providing you with a lot of lecture notes and a lot of internet material and so on. In fact, you will find a lot of material on internet on human rights. So there will be absolutely no problem about it. So what more? Now, okay, they are political, they are international, but what are human rights? Still, we have not answered this question. And what are human rights, if you ask? So they are nothing but something which targets the dignity of an individual. So the human dignity. So if there is a human being and he or she requires dignity, or dignified living is something which is a basic human right of a person. So all those things which will be required by that individual, so that he or she can live in a very dignified fashion or in a very dignified way, those rights, the conglomerate of those rights, are basically understood as human rights. So they target dignity of an individual. Also, they talk about quality of life. So this is also something which we need to understand, that there is a need to make a person's life better, right? The quality of life of human beings who are staying in developed countries and the quality of life of people who are staying in underdeveloped or developing countries are very different, and they target these understandings that people should have good quality of life, a dignified living, and definitely they are international or political by nature. So that is the understanding of human rights. So these are certain basic things with which we can start with, because there are a lot of properties of human rights, that they are numerous. They are also, they can be also divided into individual as well as group rights. There are social rights, whether social rights are genuine human rights, and all these questions. There are a lot of other things, moral norms, westernized ideas, and so on. All these things will be there. We will be discussing each of them. at a later stage. But right now we can start with this idea that human rights are political rights, human rights are international norms, human rights improves or targets the dignity of an individual and improves the quality of life. So those are basic things with which we can start with. What are human rights? Uh, Now let us try to understand that how human rights violations takes place, or who violates the human rights. If you see, uh, there is a person one, say, so person one, if he or she does something to person two, okay, so this is person one and there is a person two. So suppose there is an assault, okay, and an assault which is morally reprehensible, or is a criminal offense, or is socially unacceptable, or is politically unacceptable, or is not a dignified way of treating another individual. So is that a human rights violation? Like we were also discussing that in a lot of classes before as well, that like suppose we question this thing, that whether rape or domestic violence, right? So are these human rights violations? Hmm? So this question comes, and now you can see that in our country, this problem or this thing has become a very big problem. Every day, whenever you open a newspaper or you open your TV or start your TV and watch any news channel, you will find a lot of reports of these kind of things. This was also a big problem in our country, and it still is a big problem in our country. And whether these are human rights violations, or there are so many things which we call as human rights violations, or what are those things, whether those things which we call as human rights violations are human rights violations or not, is something which we need to understand. So the question is, like, if there is a person has assaulted in some fashion, there can be more things, right? uh, Against person 2, so whether it is a human rights violation. Now, usually we think that rape is a human rights violation, or domestic violence is definitely a human rights violation, or there are so many other things which people do to other people, and those are completely targeting the dignity of individual, or say morally degrading those people, degrading their dignity or degrading their quality of life, and so on. So whether they should be understood as human rights violations? The answer is no. A person in person cannot violate the human rights of another person. It is actually the state. So the violator is always the state. State is the violator of human rights. This is something which you need to understand. Okay. Uh, how the state does. Sometimes state is directly responsible for human rights violation. Like, what are human rights violation? We will have a complete list of the things which we will be studying. But before that, let me tell you, state violates human rights of a person either directly or indirectly. Now, what is directly and what is indirectly? A person cannot violate a human right of another person. They can go for criminal offense. They can do something which is morally reprehensible, ethically unacceptable, socially unjustified, right? And so on, against the law, all these things. But whether it's a human rights violation, the answer is that the state is basically the violator of human right. Now, how the state becomes a violator of human rights? State sometimes is directly involved in certain kind of activities, like they can censor certain kind of information. They do not let you know a lot of things. They can also stop you from expressing something, right? So this is also a basic human rights violation. They can put you on exile. They can put you on house arrest, right? There can be torture by the police. Now, police is an organ of state. So police, army, defense, government officials, bureaucrats, politicians, state as a whole, judiciary, right, executive, all these people, if they, by virtue of the powers, by virtue of the authority which is vested in them, uh, go on to violate some of the rights of people, then it becomes a human rights violation. There are a lot of things like this. We will have the list of all these things, and these are basically direct involvement of state in human rights violation. But state also indirectly is a perpetrator of human rights violation. Now, how does it happen? Like, suppose if there is something going on in our country, right? And the state is unable to stop that, or is unable to make a conducive environment so that people can live peacefully, or even if there is a victim, and that victim is not getting the justice, right? The violators, the people who have committed something against the people, they are set free, they are not punished, the punitive action was not appropriate, so those things also becomes human rights violation. Now, you must be knowing that government officials, be it defense services, be it police services, be it ministers, be it some kind of other people as well, enjoy some kind of immunities. So they may not be able to, or you cannot question their activities, or you cannot question their actions at a lot of places. And because of that, a lot of human rights violations takes place. And I'm not only talking about in peace conditions, even in warfare or armed conflict also, there are a lot of human rights violations which takes place. And the violators are basically the organs of the state, whether it is the defense, whether it is the police, whether it is some kind of other law enforcing authorities. They go on to do a lot of activities. So if the state is unable to stop these things, or unable to provide justice to the victims, so those also becomes human rights violations. But given all these things, or given this basic idea of all these things, allow me to tell you one thing more. The notion of human rights is, if you see, let me start with this. Our country is at a very low, I will say, if you see the human rights index, so you will find our country at a very lower strata. At some point of the time, it was somewhere around 140. Now I was reading, so it is somewhere around 90 to 100 and so on. But if you see the Nordic nations, if you see the Scandinavian countries, they are always the top scorers, or the best countries as far as human rights index is concerned. And our country, or most of the developing countries, will be falling short. And we feel like that our countries are not good places to stay, or are engaged in a lot of human rights violations and so on, or the state is engaged in a lot of human rights violation. But this understanding also needs to be, I will say, refurbished. And what is that which we need to understand here? The state is not always at fault. Try to understand. The notions of human rights, if I talk about the notions of human rights, they are very, very westernized concepts. Okay. Now, the westernized concepts are not something which can be dealt in the Eastern countries or in the developing countries. They are not only westernized, they are also very, I will say, developed notions. And these notions may not be acceptable, or may not be applicable to the Eastern countries, or the countries which are developing by nature or underdeveloped by nature, because there are a lot of problems with developing and underdeveloped economies, as well as with Eastern countries. And also, these notions are more like for homogeneous population. On the other hand, if you see the populace of our nation, it is very, very heterogeneous by nature. We speak different languages, we come from different origins, we also have different religions, we are also divided by caste system, we are also having very regional biases, and so on. So applying the notions of human rights to a heterogeneous nation is a very difficult task. It is not as easy as in Nordic nations or in Scandinavian nations, where people speak more or less the same language, and they come from the same culture, and they have more or less the same religion and so on. And moreover, they are also very, very strong economies. developing nations or underdeveloped nations do not have strong economies, and because of that there are a lot of notions, a lot of things to uh, there are a lot of problems with that. So when we talk about human rights and we say that the state is a violator and the state is always at wrong footing, that is also not a correct way, because the state itself is having a lot of limitations, and they also have to follow a lot of rules and regulations, and people are also bounded by a lot of cultures. So doing something for one culture or one set of people goes wrong against some kind of people, right? So those understandings are also something which you need to understand. So state is not always at fault. This is something which you should understand. And human rights are more applicable, if you see, to Western nations. This is because the properties of human rights are more applicable for Western countries, for developed countries. So this is also one thing, and also for homogeneous populations. So this also needs to be understood, because if you see, our nations, we are heterogeneous populations, so we are not homogeneous nations, we are not developed economies, and we are also not Western countries. So the ideas, the concepts of human rights are not very easily applicable, though we have tried quite a lot, and we are trying to get better and better, but then also there are certain other problems which are there. There is one thing more because of which our human rights, or we fall down in the understanding of human rights, and that is social rights. Now, what are social rights? Let us try to understand. Uh, Sometimes there is a question like, are social rights genuine human rights? Because there are political rights, there are these rights, there are group rights, minority rights, so on. A lot of things you will study, we will study. What are social rights? Social rights basically target the quality of life of an individual, right? So the quality of the life of an individual requires a lot of things, like employment opportunities, or social security, education, and so on. Quality of life, like the right to vacation, right to leisure, and so on. All these things are basically social rights, and for this you require a lot of money, very very good financial status to manage these rights, right? And they are not available to underdeveloped or developing nations, equivalent to the understanding of, say, developed countries, right? So because of that also we fall down. So the question is whether social rights are genuine human rights. Definitely they are human rights, there is absolutely no question about it, and they are also genuine by nature, but their implementation is something which requires a time period, right? So it is not the case that overnight or fortnight we will be equivalent to the developed nations, or their understanding, whether it is education, whether it is leisure, whether it is right to vacation, whether it is so many other things, the social security and so on, which the developed countries people enjoy and we do not. So those understanding also need to be, or those things also need to be taken care of, because we usually go down because of social rights as well. So this thing also you need to keep it in your mind. So this was like the first lecture, the general lecture, which you can have in your mind, so that you have a platform for understanding how to study human rights. And in the next lecture we will be discussing what are the human rights, or what are those things which you will be studying in this course. In fact, this course is meant for a lot of people, right? We offer this course to nursing people, we offer this course also to BTech students, we also offer this course to say MSc economics students, and so on. And the course structure is more or less the same, but still, because of the difference of the populace as well as the difference of the gentry, we also have changed certain topics from one another. So I will enlist a comprehensive idea of all the things which we study under human rights in the next lecture. But we may not be, because of certain courses, we will not be covering all the things together in one course, but definitely in these lectures you will find all the material, but it may not be the part of your own course. But with this understanding, remember one thing. First, that human rights are political norms or political rights. They are very, very Western by nature. They are international by nature. The state has to provide these rights to the individuals. The state only is the violator of these rights, but the state is not always wrong. So all these things you should keep in mind so that you have a better idea, because the idea behind studying these things is not to become a human rights activist, is also not to become a person who will have complaints all over the place, rather than to understand that how human beings suffer because of certain kind of policies, and why state cannot implement a lot of things even if they will like to do that. So with this I leave you, uh, so that you can think in a better way and in the right way, to have a complete grasp about, or to have a complete idea about, or the understanding about human rights. Thank you.